today's podcast, when I came into it, I was going to talk about a bunch of different things. And you told me that you're dealing with quote unquote shrimps too. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that is, why it matters, and why should a life sciences company, say, for example, working with clinical trials, care?
Right. And so this is actually really interesting in the life sciences space, because a lot of my clients that sit sort of in that ecosystem, you're used to dealing with sensitive data. You're used to dealing with clinical trial data, research data, et cetera. But oftentimes you're dealing with not necessarily the direct patient data, but sort of a subset of that data. There's been some derivatives removed from it, the personalization has been removed from it, et cetera. So there's sort of this belief that you sort of fall outside of some of these more general privacy regulations because you're so regulated in sort of the clinical trial space of what you're doing. And so I think it's a shock for a lot of them when we sort of sit down and we start saying, well, actually you might fall into the GDPR or the other sort of general privacy regulations, because is that truly anonymized data or is it pseudonymized, which pseudonymized would fall under the GDPR, anonymized would truly fall out of it. And then you really delve into it and there's sort of some more nuances to be aware of. So I think, when looking at SHREMS 2, you first question you need to ask yourself, if it matters to you, is, am I collecting data from the European Union? And if I am, I've got to do some GDPR analysis because I have to understand, is the GDPR going to impact my data? But sort of putting the GDPR not to the side, but sort of the global question of am I impacted by it? Why did SHREMS 2 matter? And sort of how did we get here? So a continual point of tension. Yeah.
Before you continue, I think we need to draw that distinction because it's such an important distinction that point you're calling out, which is anonymized versus pseudo-anonymized. What is the difference? Why does it matter?
Yeah, and so in full disclosure, I've done a lot of research in this space on my academic side, and we'll have some forthcoming sort of guidance that I'll be able to share, hopefully, when it gets published. But this is a very interesting area. What is personal information, personal data, and what is not personal information and personal data? And the challenge in this space is that we use these terms pseudonymization, de-identification, anonymization, aggregation, to really all sort of mean varying different things when it comes to removing identifiers from information. And the added complexity is that not all of the laws define those terms equally. So comparing, say, the Japanese Data Privacy Act to the GDPR to the CCPA, they all use various different terms, define them differently, but they're all sort of getting at this idea of data that can't be used to identify the individual. So it's really important that you sit down with someone who's fairly knowledgeable on the legal side to understand, okay, in GDPR, anonymization has 3 factors that the European Data Protection Board has laid out. And if you can't meet those 3 factors, then you're not going to have anonymized data. We have to define it differently. But at the same time, there needs to be the technical side sitting down that same conversation, because the law is going to tell you we have to be able to demonstrate X, Y, or Z. And the technical group is going to be able to tell you, this is actually what we're doing to the data. This is how we're manipulating it. This is how we're removing the data. We can't re-identify it. The statistical likelihood of re-identifying it so low that the risk isn't there. So it is a really good distinction that you call out, because I find a lot of companies assume their data is anonymized, but they haven't necessarily done the due diligence to really look at the legal definition of anonymization, look at how they're technically addressing anonymization and ensuring that they match together. So that's an area that I think is really confusing, because the law is a bit all over the place, and the technology, candidly, is also a little bit all over the place, because I don't even think there's necessarily a true sort of industry standard when it comes to anonymization techniques, pseudonymization techniques, de-identification, blah, 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 all those terminologies. So it's a good distinction to call out, and it's something that I think, especially in the life sciences, because you are dealing with what I would say, you have personal data, you have non-personal data, and then there's like this really gray area in between that life sciences sits in at varying levels. And what you need to do is figure out for each data set, like, what am I actually getting?
And I think it's important not just in the live studies you're doing, it's also important when you're talking about things like transparency. There's a whole element, and I don't know, Jordan, if you get involved in this at all, but I do. And it's basically this area where the EMA, which is the European version of the FDA, comes out and goes, we want you to disclose everything. Those applications you made, to us, we're going to disclose everything. So you can pull out the things that are considered to be either confidential business information or information that should be de-identified, anonymized, or pseudo-anonymized. And you have to make an argument for that. But to your point, that process has already started, and it's hugely complicated. So talking to someone like Jordan is often a great idea. Talking to the lawyer that's right for you is often critical. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So you draw that distinction. You talk about,
yes,
connect that a little bit further for me into Schrems.
Yeah, and I will say, just as a side note, I clerked on the European Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the EU system, and I actually handled some of the EMA transparency cases while I was a clerk on that court. So I'm heavily aware of sort of that component, and that was actually my introduction to data privacy and transparency, was through the EU courts and looking at sort of the EMA decisions and the requirements and comparing them to the FDA, because we sort of were looking to comparative sort of framework. So really interesting. I happen to be more well-versed in that than you probably would have assumed. So to talk a little bit more about Schrems 2, what was so impactful is, and this is a continual tension between the EU and the US, is transferring personal data from the European Union, where privacy is a fundamental right, to the United States, where we do not have an omnibus federal privacy law. And there are concerns, especially in light of things like the Snowden leaks and some other sort of changes in the US surveillance law, where the EU has consistently challenged and questioned whether EU personal data that is transferred to the United States is truly being provided sort of the GDPR protections as they would require under their law. So what we had was in Schrems 1, the safe harbor provision, which was the agreement between the EU and the US to transfer data internationally, was invalidated. So very quickly thereafter, we had the EU's privacy shield be adopted between the EU and the United States. And in July of 2020, so last summer, the EU court again invalidated the EU's privacy shield, and really on very similar terms as they invalidated in Schrems 1, the safe harbor provision. And basically, there was this huge concern around the use of US surveillance laws by intelligence agencies to access personal data when it would be transferred to the United States. And they really highlighted a few concerns specifically with that. One is whether or not the individuals would even know that their data was going to be visible to public agencies, knowing so that they could then maybe refute that or sort of use legal process to get some redress. And two is whether or not there was any capability of the companies to prevent that action from being taken. We have these sort of cables that run under the Atlantic, for those of you that aren't aware of it. And there are some capabilities of the intelligence agencies to sort of capture data before it even were to hit some of the company's servers. And so that capability really scares the EU government, especially when it comes to ensuring that there's privacy protections. So Schrems 2 invalidated the EU's privacy shield, which some of you might have self-certified under, although it was still quite new. So we did not have sort of a large proportion of private entities that had self-certified under that mechanism. But what was frankly more impactful was that the EU court upheld the continued use of standard contractual clauses, which were a contractual mechanism to import data into the United States. But what it said was that in certain instances, a la sending data to the United States, the companies may need to implement supplementary measures to ensure that the same or adequate level of protection is being provided to that data when it comes to the United States. So why does this all matter to life sciences? Why does this matter to private industry? The real challenge is that it really puts the onus and the burden and the obligation on the companies to confirm that what they're doing is really going to comply with EU law. So the court sort of left open what are those supplementary measures that would be appropriate, and then made very clear that we're not going to tell you what those measures are, but we're going to require you to figure it out, to do it, and to sort of do the assessment and do the analysis. So it really puts a lot of burden on companies, and we've really been seeing a lot of things like security questionnaires that are saying, how are you addressing surveillance laws within the United States? Are you taking supplementary measures? If you were to be requested by a public agency to have access to data, what are the steps that you would take, et cetera, which is really sort of requiring all US companies to do this deep due diligence on US surveillance laws, which if you had asked us a couple of years ago if we as private entities would be doing that due diligence, I don't know if many of us would have sort of gone down that path. So the question starts with, do I have personal data? And then it bleeds into, if I have personal data, how am I going to ensure that that data is being provided adequate protection if and when it comes to the United States? So that's like a big area that I have seen impacting sort of global data transfers, global data privacy, and it's impacting businesses across all industries, all sizes. It really comes down to, do I have personal data under the GDPR? And if you do, you need to do a Schrems analysis.
So you talk about the Schrems analysis and how that sort of is changing how companies who are not even in the EU have to deal with basically figuring out how to deal with data coming across EU borders.